Hello, welcome back to another fantasy world building video. Today I'm talking about Earth, or the Earth that was. Some fantasy books are set within the planet Earth. Now it could be a version of our Earth that's gone through a dramatic post-apocalyptic event, and therefore what's happened in the result is that people have gone back to kind of a middle age level of living and people with swords and shields and that kind of basic level of technology. Or it could be that it's thousands of years ago, well before anything that we know, or that it's just in a slightly different version of Earth, a parallel Earth, if you like. And there are pros and cons to having your fantasy world set within that kind of a space. I'm going to talk about some of those today. One of the benefits is you don't have to explain as much to the reader because they kind of know what some of the basic things are. If a character comes across something, you can just say, it used to be a shop, it used to be a garage, they don't have cars anymore, but they understand the word garage, and it used to be some sort of space for storing vehicles or carriages. They could say motorized carriages. And there are benefits to having it, things like that, where you can just kind of shortcut. You don't have to explain, you don't have to go into detail, whereas if it's within a fantasy world and you've created something completely new, you have to put the detail in, you have to lay it out for the reader, you have to sketch a picture within the mind of the reader so that they can see it through what your eyes and what you've created. Whereas with an Earth that was, you can just kind of shorthand a lot of things. So that's one benefit. The flip side of that is that if the reader knows, but the characters don't, you have this kind of dramatic irony where they come across maybe something, a strange glowing rock, and when they pick it up they think, oh, that's quite interesting, but then everyone starts to get sick, and of course the reader will be going, well, it's some kind of radioactive thing, but the characters are there going, oh, I don't know why I'm getting ill, this magic rock is supposed to be beneficial. And that just gets really irritating because the reader knows, they're waiting for the characters to catch up, and it can just be really frustrating. So getting the balance right is really important. Setting the book on Earth comes with a number of expectations. Even if you've moved it thousands of years into the future, people will probably want some kind of a map. And if the land is dramatically changed so much that it's only a little bit familiar, people will still be looking for familiar landmarks. Like it could be that characters are wandering through an ancient civilization that was destroyed thousands of years ago, and there's this strange sort of pyramid-like structure in the middle of this forest. And people are going, right, okay, it was the pyramids of Giza, now it's something else, but the characters don't know, but the readers do. So it comes with expectations that something's going to crop up that's familiar, something in the story is going to touch on various elements, landmarks, people, technology, whatever it might be. So that's another reader expectation that comes with setting it on Earth, or a version of Earth. Another benefit of setting it on Earth is you can introduce things very, very quickly. I talked about in the previous food and drink video where you can have everything that's familiar and you don't need to go into any more detail. You know, whether it's cows and sheep and crops and all this kind of stuff, and people are growing it and it's familiar and you know what it is, you know how it works, people understand it, and agriculture and all of that sort of stuff. There again, it's a great shorthand and you can just put it into the story, people know, and off you go. You can use those elements. If you think about Game of Thrones, the TV series I'm talking about, not the books, to begin with, when you first start watching that, it could have been, the first few episodes, it could have been a version of Earth, because there wasn't anything that was dramatically different or alien or fantastical. It was only when you got further into the story where they started talking about dire wolves. And, you know, we did have them in the past, or a version of that, thousands of years ago on Earth, okay. And then they start talking about dragons. And there again, you could have said, oh, well, they're talking about dinosaurs. And it could be that's what they're actually talking about. It isn't until you get quite far into the TV series that you suddenly get actual real dragons, giants wandering around, magic and all this kind of stuff. So up to that point, it could have been Earth. Why not? So there's different ways you can approach it. You could have Earth and then you add in the fantastical stuff on top of it. Some other great authors have done that, whether it's Terry Brooks with his Shannara books. It's revealed a long time late into the series that it is a version of Earth, and he even did that with his Word and the Void trilogy, which is sort of set in relatively modern day. It's about a guy, it's a sort of urban fantasy trilogy, and at some point later on, it's only a tiny spoiler, he suggests that all of these are actually connected and they're all set within the same world, at different time periods. So he's playing around with time and he has magic on top. The flip side of that is if you have all of these things that are familiar, landmarks, technology, food and all that sort of stuff, you could be limited. If you suddenly want to have a totally different landmass, but it's in the middle of something, people go, well, actually, that's in the middle of America, and you want to make it riddled with loads of lakes and streams and huge mountains, when actually it's just a completely flat prairie. You could then say, oh, well, there's been some kind of dramatic shifting of the tectonic plates, and it's created this mountain range, and therefore what you know isn't what's actually here, so I can kind of do whatever I want and make it up and change it around. That brings me back to kind of the first question I would ask is, why are you then setting it on Earth or a version of Earth? Why does it have to be Earth? Is there any reason that's really, really critical that you started it on Earth? Maybe when you first started building this fantasy world, you had a map of Earth and then you played around the edges and you started changing it and you moved forward from there. So it was a great starting point. But equally, you could get any map that you've just scribbled on a page, go onto Fantasy Map Generator, start with that, and then start building it that way. It doesn't have to be Earth. So my question is, if you're setting your fantasy world on a version of Earth, what's the reason? What's the core element in your story that relies on it? It could be that partway into the story, some characters find this ancient technology and there's these special ancient weapons that are going to change the course of the warfare. And the reader's going, well, yeah, it's a machine gun. Whereas they don't understand what it is, but it's going to change everything where people are fighting with swords and shields and crossbows and bows and arrows. And then you're suddenly bringing a bunch of assault rifles. Yeah, okay, that has to be Earth and it's going to change everything. I've talked about bigger weapons, whether it's something nuclear or it's just radiation, or it could be diseases, or it could be medicine or something that's very, very specific, and that's why you've had it on Earth. I'm not saying you shouldn't, I'm not saying you can't do it, I'm just saying if you're going to do it, there has to be a good reason. There needs to be balance, there needs to be internal logic to the story. I've talked about this in the past as well, but I think when we start creating fantasy worlds, we're often a bit blinkered to begin with. We start with what's familiar and we just kind of go down the same tracks. Whereas you're actually only limited by your imagination. There's no budget, there's no special effects budget. Just do whatever you want. Create something totally radically different on every level. And how far that goes before it becomes science fiction, that's a good question. There are kind of limits on things like technology, I would say. And there's another video on technology here on the channel, so check that out. But fantasy books tend to have certain familiar elements. Level of technology is one up to a certain point. Magic, or maybe even something supernatural, is another element. Setting a book on Earth can restrict you creatively, unless there's a very specific reason to have it on a version of Earth. So my question would always be, again, why does it need to be Earth? None of my books have been set on Earth. I didn't start with a version of Earth and then go something completely different. I've seen some great fantasy books where they talk about something much, much broader because it isn't Earth. It could be that they look into the sky and there are 3 moons, and therefore it's totally, it's not Earth, it's not our solar system, it's not our planet. There is a sun. Then you get into other kind of things to do with time. The Earth moves around the sun, the solar system, and so on. How many days are there in a month? How many days are there in the year? All of that kind of thing. How much time you want to play with. How many hours of daylight you want to play with. All of these things kind of feed in. There again, whenever I talk about fantasy world building, the depth that you go, the level that you go is completely up to you. But I always say you shouldn't spend forever on fantasy world building and no time on the actual writing. You need to get on with writing the book. So set the foundation. If it is on Earth, create the limits, create the structure, create the barriers where people know they're not suddenly going to drop over the edge and it won't make any sense to them. If you introduce something early enough that tells the reader this is Earth, then it sets up certain levels of expectation in their mind, which is fine, but you have to understand that as the creator. So you need to be aware of the pros and cons of setting it on Earth or a version of Earth. That's it for today. I'll be back soon with another video.